200 years ago. The door opened to the underground facility, and Jaken warily stepped across the threshold. 10 years on the run had led to this. It had taken the last decade to build this place as a last resort, and he had a decision to make. Jaken's mind raced as a man silently walked him around the control center. How had it come to this? It was all Jaken could think about for the last 3 days. He still didn't know what he would do, despite now being faced with the result of lives lost and secrets protected as this building was constructed. It was barely lit in a dark green light. Only the controls and a few of the human-sized holding cells were able to be seen. There was nothing else here. It was just a single room, controls, and places for people to be placed. Jaken breathed deeply. It didn't alleviate his sense of helplessness. The man who had led Jaken inside the room clasped a hand on his leader's shoulder.
How did all of this go so wrong?
10 years earlier, the world was embroiled in a world war, its third. The war wasn't as deadly as the previous two, but the Shepherd's Council had refused to act as the years had stretched on. The violence increased, and the weapons improved. Every one of the shepherds outside the council was involved in the war, and being that close to the battle, they saw the hopelessness ahead and the pointless death. After the shepherds met and exchanged battle plans for a big strategic push, they made their decision. The Day of Revelation, as it became known around the world, was when a dozen men and women with the most forceful powers used them to end the fighting. Only arms were destroyed, and means of maintaining an army on a battlefield. No country could further wage war on a large scale. Tanks, missile silos, jets, ships. They were all disabled, or in other ways made unfit for combat. The fallout looked positive, as an armistice was declared in just 36 hours. However, the peace was only related to the war between countries. The news ran with the stories of beings with super abilities that had destroyed all of their means to wage war. This led to weeks of debate about the possible threat these people posed and what their true intentions might be. The council who policed and delivered justice to the shepherds finally decided to act. They turned over the original 12 who'd broken the first law of shepherds: always keep their existence a secret. Others who had revealed themselves throughout the time of the first shepherds usually did so unintentionally and would end their own lives. This was so that people who had seen them could not capture them or spread anything more than a legend of a man or a woman of great power. Jaken had spoken as the defender of the 12, though he disagreed with their decision and had refused participation with them despite being asked. He wondered now if that had been his best decision. Jaken stood in the room, observing all the pods as they were finally set in place. These would each contain people in the next few days. 400 to be exact. He pulled at his military uniform top in an attempt to smooth it, and his feelings. Jaken wanted desperately to splash water on his face. It was hard to convince himself that after the initial experiment, he would be faced with an inevitable decision that may kill him. 26 days was how long he was hospitalized after the first experiment, the goal of which would give him the ability to expand his powers. 26 days. It had been 26 days before he recovered from the last time they tried this. Jaken knew this would likely kill him. He'd spent the hours before coming into this building dry heaving.
It's ready for the selected candidates, sir.
The man who stood next to Jaken had controlled this project from the first day the decision was made. That decision was to use Jaken's abilities to alter reality and destroy all modern technology. The result, Jaken and the other shepherds hoped, would be to eliminate the ability for humankind to track them or fight them.
Oscar Morgan.
Jaken broke the silence with the man's full name. He couldn't understand how this man tasked with the job for nearly 10 years seemed to have no care about its intent or risks.
You have done great work here. I only pray its result is exactly as we plan.
I plan to use a slow build, rather than turning the machine on to full power at once.
Oscar looked at the highest row of holding cells, not wanting to meet their leader's gaze just now.
This will likely mean more pain for you, but in our simulations, it gives us a maximum radius for your power.
Oscar cut off his leader before the man could add his thoughts.
There is no guarantee we'll reach full coverage, but the simulation reached 82% before you were decimated, sir.
Decimated. Jaken almost wanted to laugh. This was sure a strange way of referring to his death. Oddly, though, he found the talk of a likely success a better salve to his worries than smoothing his uniform or dry heaving. Over the last week, they'd brought the candidates in for the project in small numbers. If they had brought in all 400 at once, it would have given them away. The camp outside was shielded by a few shepherds with camouflage abilities. The group was kept in tents outside the facility and aware of their fate. 400 specially selected men and women, mostly older, but there were some young ones too. When Jaken stepped out of the building, over to the camp, he reached out to their elected official. Jaken had asked them to select someone so that needs could be easily directed to him and met. The domed building with the holding cells was underground, however the camp was above ground and several hundred yards away. This was an attempt to make sure if the people were discovered, the building might still remain hidden.
Max, good day.
The man saluted. Jaken liked that.
The camp is in very good spirits right now, sir.
Jaken gave an acknowledging nod.
Please bring them out. The day is going to be here soon, and I'd like to tell them everything.
Everything, sir?
Everything.
It took about 10 minutes before the 400 people gathered before him, the last few pushing to get into formation like a military squad. Jaken observed them for a long minute before he cleared his throat.
You all know why you are here, ladies and gentlemen.
Jaken cringed inwardly at the pathetic icebreaker.
This project is our last resort.
He gave the crowd a once-over with a serious gaze.
Most of you know the truth. We are tired of running, tired of being hunted down and imprisoned. We are faced with death in the midst of vile experimentation at the hands of corrupt governments, driven to create more of us. Our fate is sealed if we are weaponized for battle. The fight for us is impossible. Throughout history, there have only been a few thousand of us.
Jaken's mind wound up with the strain of all those who had hopelessly fought or been captured.
There was only one solution: to find a way to protect ourselves that didn't involve direct conflict with humankind. Oscar, the man you all met during your selection process, proposed an idea to me after seeing my powers in action. I bent the state of reality and destroyed a small army. In fact, removing it from existence.
Jaken held his hand up to quiet the smattering of cheers he heard from the crowd.
Oscar believed that if I could somehow eliminate technology, I could eliminate the means for humans to hunt us. As you saw over the last decade, humans are resourceful, and though we had eliminated most of their technological means to wage war on a vast scale, we still left enough for them to wage a smaller war against us.
Jaken began to pace back and forth in front of the gathering, keeping a constant gaze as he spoke, though he found himself looking through them rather than at them.
Oscar and I attempted an experiment in which my power would be boosted by using the energy of another shepherd placed in a machine like a battery. It sounds really crude, but the end result was that my powers became stronger and stretched for miles. I used my powers to strip technology, all of it, out of that radius, and I was successful. The truth, though, gentlemen and ladies, is that I can't guarantee complete success here, and the end result will assuredly be all of your deaths.
Jaken stopped pacing, turned and stood tall, and at attention like his years in the military had trained him to. He looked out among the crowd. If their resolve was shaken, it wasn't reflected in their faces. Fear of what was known had pushed them all here.
I will do my damnedest to make sure this works. No matter the pain I must endure in the next few days, you will not go out in a useless gesture.
Jaken knew he couldn't guarantee that with certainty, even with Oscar's simulations, but he had to say something to someone, more to convince himself than them.
I will ensure the protection of our people. It's time to end this struggle.
Cheers erupted from the crowd, and they did much to lift Jaken's mind for a time. As the hours ticked down, though, he found himself back in his own private quarters, dry heaving and splashing cold water on his face.
This is Arkneo Masato, and you're listening to Shepard, Journey of the Time Walker.
Jaken hadn't eaten or slept much when he stepped through the door to the facility where Oscar was already preparing people and placing them into pods. Someone noticing Jaken's struggle to walk from exhaustion and hunger grabbed him under the arm gently and helped him reach his pod. A circular window pane would provide Jaken's only view of the outside world.
I'll be leaving his pod open until final preparation is complete.
The man holding Jaken's arm nodded and finished guiding the leader into his pod. Even strapping the man into a harness and making sure all the equipment was hooked up, Jaken didn't just feel helpless, he was helpless. After nearly an hour sitting in the pod, his anxiety building, Jaken felt the slightest relief as Oscar approached his pod.
This is a mixture of pain suppressant and adrenaline, sir.
The man pushed the syringe into a port on Jaken's arm. Jaken hadn't even been attentive enough to realize he'd been prepped in such a way. As the pod hatch closed, leaving only the small circular window as his means to view the outside, Jaken's anxiety spiked once more. A sheet of sweat seemed to erupt from every pore of his skin. He tried deep breaths, but when the adrenaline kicked in, it was a nightmare. He forced his eyes closed and tried to empty his mind of any thoughts whatsoever.
Okay, Jaken. Initializing Phase 1 in 10 seconds.
Oscar's voice came through an earpiece. He listened to the countdown, with the electric and mechanical whirring beginning to fill up his pod. He forced his eyes open.
No, wait.
He tried to scream, but the words were barely a breath. And then the worst pain he ever felt ripped through his body, and the last thing he could see was the light that seared his eyes and flesh. Present day. Jaken jerked awake from his memory of Doomsday. He often dreamed of this moment. It was like his mind taunted him with the reality that he could never alter this particular moment in time. This one choice had changed the course of the entire world. Water, sir? Jaken didn't even acknowledge the man, but took the water he offered and gulped it down. Pushing the dream from his mind, he handed the empty cup back to his right-hand man.
The loss of Zeke sets us back, Darren. You know how he gets, and you should have rounded him up before you returned here.
I apologize, sir, but no one could have foreseen.
Be quiet.
Jaken waved his hand in irritation.
Foreseen or not, this hinders my divide and conquer strategy against William and his shepherds, and the human cronies. We can confront them, but this is a lot messier without some means to pull their forces apart to other locations.
Jaken had been counting on the fire user to burn several lands and small villages, forcing soldiers and shepherds to be dispatched in response. Without the means to inflict the damage quickly, the strategy would no longer work as intended. With the push at Stonehaven repelled thanks to Caitlin Cass's sacrifice, it meant all this effort was wasted. Jaken leaned back in his chair, his sparse room a continuous reminder of his imprisonment here.
I will have come up with a new strategy. This time, it will be with me leading the charge.
His glare caused the puppeteer to shrivel, but the man replied to Jaken in a voice that didn't reflect his physical response.
Sir, it will be a glorious day when you return to the battlefield.
This is R.C. Anthus, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
On the road leaving Oberon, a man held the reins of horses as two young men faced off up the road a bit. The two had quickly been joined, though not in their fight, by a woman who was apparently known to the man Varric, who had originally secured passage in the man's trading cart. The man watched in utter confusion as the two young men squared off, and the other two seemed content to observe.
Enough, Byron, enough!
Ben had barely repelled the attack of his angry younger brother. He was surprised by the resolve and the fluid experience in the martial arts. Cass had been the right choice. Ben felt a pang of guilt before closing off his senses and facing his brother's next attack.
Master Cass is dead because of you.
Byron's flurry wasn't careless despite his heightened emotions, though Cass had constantly berated him for his impulsiveness and anger. Rather than suppress his feelings as he was taught, Byron decided to utilize the energy and intensity within his combat. This allowed him to flow much easier mentally than always having to be calm or cool when he wasn't good at that type of thing. A flurry of attacks was easily blocked by Ben, but Byron saw a pattern. Ben's powers allowed him the ability to respond a full second before an attack landed, making him hard to hit. In fact, a square landing of a blow didn't even mean success, as most blows would pass through him as though he wasn't there. In as smooth a motion as he could, Byron ducked down and swept his leg out, catching and passing through both ankles. Quickly pushing up and launching off his feet, Byron attempted to collide with Ben's chest. The differing attacks would likely disorient him a little, Byron had hoped. He didn't want to kill his older brother, just hurt him, and punish him for not being there when his home needed him. Byron didn't know how many hits he wanted to land, but when he did land one, he was sure he would know when to stop. After passing harmlessly through most of Ben's body, Byron heard the horse start to panic. He saw Ben check on the horse out of the corner of his eye, and Byron took his shot. He landed two punches, one to the stomach and one under Ben's jaw.
Shouldn't we stop them?
Nope. They're bonding.
Byron had noticed that Ben hadn't been countering his blows. He'd only used his powers to negate Byron's attacks. Knowing he didn't actually have to defend against an actual counterattack allowed him to press harder for an advantage. Sure, Ben may have been taking it easy, but that wasn't Byron's fault. Ben's face flared in anger as he cleared the pain from those two hard blows. Byron grinned cruelly. He immediately created some distance. He knew his brother was finally serious.
There you are, brother.
Byron easily countered the blows Ben wanted to land, and Ben countered his the same way. There were a few exchanges like this, and both brothers knew the other was now beyond backing down. Incapacitation or an injury was likely at this point. Byron concentrated just enough to increase his strength twofold. He didn't want a sudden mass of muscle giving him away. When Byron struck, Ben was easily knocked off balance, blood dripping from his mouth, and the wind knocked from him. However, Byron didn't see the next several blows that took him down, or how he ended up violently being crushed against his brother's chest. Ben had had enough, and in a pulse of his time control ability, he struck several blows against his younger brother. He stood frozen in place, unable to fight back. Each joint was struck, and then Ben brought the boy into a forceful hug.
There wasn't anything I could do.
Ben didn't relinquish his grip, despite the suddenness of the pain and the impact of the blows. Ben doubted he'd be able to maintain this position if Byron used all his strength, having already increased it with his powers in the last exchange.
I'm sorry.
Ben loosened his grip just a slight bit when he felt Byron's body relax against him. That did it. Byron lost his will. Ben had apologized. The pain in his older brother's voice when he said there was nothing he could do was reality breaking through for the first time for the white-haired prince of impulsive, emotional, explosive attacks. Soon, Byron was returning the hug.
Why did you go away?
Ben couldn't tell him that, though he wanted to. None of this was anyone's fault. It was just how it had to be, and it had taken years and a conversation with his departed mother to accept it. Destiny. Byron's destiny had unfolded before him, and so like a careful craftsman, he built and dug, protected the path Byron would have to follow. A path that would soon, somehow end Benjamin Haynes' own life before he would see Byron arrive there. He continued the hug. It had been 5 years since he'd seen his brother, and despite the premonition that he'd gotten about his own death just 3 days after Byron was born, he never looked at his brother as anything other than someone he cared deeply for.
I love you, Byron. I always will. I know you're angry and confused right now, but I promise I will answer everything for you someday soon.
Ben breathed out painfully, holding back all the things he felt about these years apart, his brother's future and his own future. He just bottled these things up. They were hard to reveal when no one else knew what it was like to walk through time. Ben could see any outcomes he wished, though the further he got away from his present self, the future was clouded and murky. The closer he got to certain events, Ben could fill in gaps pretty accurately. When he finally explained in totality what he saw to his parents and explained Byron's destiny in all of it, they seemed almost nonplussed about it. He laughed out loud as he thought about it.
What's so funny?
Byron was now standing in front of Ben after pulling him from his brother's grasp.
Nothing.
Ben shook his head and Byron glared, but with annoyance instead of anger. The moments of their fight passed.
Are you girls done already?
Varric and Elizabeth figured it was safe to approach now. It turns out waiting had been the right call. Though Elizabeth didn't think she would ever admit this to someone like Varric, who gave off the signals of a massive ego and something else she couldn't quite put her finger on.
Hey, Varric, why don't you shut your big hairy face, alright?
The smirk on Byron's face confirmed to his bodyguard that this time-wasting moment had passed.
Well, we found you. What now?
Varric looked directly into the face of the man who had insisted Varric become his younger brother's bodyguard, but more than that, had saved his life.
We head to the frontier in Fort William. Jaken sent an army through to Stonehaven Keep. He damn sure would have had to pass through the 2 major barracks there. I want to know what happened to them.
Excuse me, Mr. Varric? Sir? I have a schedule to keep.
My apologies. We'll set out in just a few minutes.
Varric directed Byron to go sit in the cart. The young man obeyed only because he was weary from the early morning and the expulsion of energy during the fight. When he settled in the cart, he pulled his cloak hood over his eyes, closed them, and let the slow rocking motion of the cart set him off to sleep. They all had no idea the horrors that awaited them on the frontier.